Okay, I think maybe this is a good time to get started. It's great to see everyone here for what I think is the first joint AI and Humanity plus the MA program joint conference. It's delighted to have our first speaker, Anand, Vaidya, talking to us about artificial intelligence, moral standing, and emotions. And it'll be the first of, I think, 6 talks, the 2 more today, 3 tomorrow. And take it away. You don't need to. You don't want to okay. Thanks a lot for inviting me. We're going to talk about 2 issues today. They basically come from a very common argument I hear. I live in San Francisco in Silicon Valley. I go have a lot of friends who work in AI. Our philosophical informed. So this is one of them. It's an argument that basically tries to show that artificial systems another way of saying is that they aren't sentient. So this is the common argument I hear, and some philosophers are recently commenting on a panel on AI where people were actually making these arguments. So it's not only true that uninformed computer scientists in Silicon Valley make such arguments, it's also true that philosophically informed philosophers make such arguments. Um, so yeah. So my position is diametrically opposed to the position of the common argument. So I basically think that phenomenal consciousness is not required for moral standing. I think artificial systems do have moral standing, moral patience. I think affective consciousness is not required for an emotional life. I think artificial systems have capacity for an emotional life. I think intelligence tied to preferential states is necessary for moral standing. And I think judgment slash belief plus attention is required for an emotional life. This is the basis for the common argument. So the first thing I want to do is I want to defend the view that phenomenal consciousness is not necessary for moral standing, and articulate a view on which intelligence type preferences is necessary for moral standing. Second, I want to defend the view that judgment slash belief of a certain kind plus attention is sufficient for an emotional life. And then I want to combine two views. I want to talk about what it means to have moral standing in a way where we understand it to be a great example of moral standing. For something like having intelligence tied to preferential state plus emotion means that you have a certain grade or degree of moral standing relative to others. So that's the overall structure of everything I want to talk about. And kind of the upshot of this, you know, simple line for it is that we have misunderstood the significance of sentience in relationship to the project of understanding what sort of mental state artificial systems have and what type of moral standing. That's sort of the bottom line. I'm pushing back strongly against those who are sentient, sentientists, yeah, who think that sentience is really a really important feature of which once you don't have that thing, you lose capacity for all sorts of mental states and you lose capacity for moral standing. Okay. So the first thing we have to talk about is that in talking about moral standing, it's important to distinguish between moral patency and moral agency. So we can understand that human beings, are moral agents, we're responsible for what we do. But we can also understand the notion of something being a moral patient. That is something that deserves moral concern, moral consideration, is in the moral sphere, but we don't recognize them to be full-blown moral agents. And so when I'm talking about moral status, my primary concern is about something being a moral patient. So for example, I'm going to argue that artificial systems are moral patients and rocks are not moral patients. Okay? So the idea is that I'm not really defending here today the claim that artificial systems have moral agency yet. I'm just defending the claim that they are moral patients. Now, the standard question, or what's known as the grounding question for moral standing, which has been quite popular over the last several years is the question of what is the feature in virtue of which something has moral standing, and now here again in the limited, minimal sense of being a moral patient, that puts them in the moral sphere of moral concern. What is that feature or set of features that grounds moral standing? There's two types of ways you can answer this. One is you can think that there's something like a set of necessary and sufficient conditions where you have that. Another approach is that you can take a family resemblance approach. And you can say there is really no set of necessary and sufficient conditions. There are overlapping conditions. Some things instantiate one subset of that. Some things a different subset. But being inside the sphere is really working with one common property that goes across everything. It's actually the case that I prefer the family resemblance view. That's actually the view I really truly think is correct for moral standing. But for the purposes of how the debate has unfolded in contemporary literature, I'm just going to pursue the question under the classical approach. I'm just going to take it that that's the approach that everyone prefers debating, so I'm going to go in that way. Okay, second feature. So there's this question about moral grading. So moral grading is the idea that if X and Y are in the moral sphere, it could be the case that X has greater moral standing than Y, or Y has greater moral standing than X. That's a graded view of moral standing and moral status. The opposing view says that there is no coherent notion of graded moral standing. If you have moral standing, you have it. And if you don't have it, you don't have it. There's no greater than or less than relationship.
Hello? Hello? Yeah, this one works. Okay, good. Good. Okay, so check to make sure they can hear me now. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. Sorry about that.
Okay, good. So it turns out that a book that was recently published called Moral Status Without Degrees by someone from the National Institute of Health pretty much challenges the idea that moral grading makes sense. But to what it's worth in terms of the literature and so far the 4 or 5 presentations I've given on this topic, I think a lot of people are on board that grading does make sense. So I'm just going to, again, pursue this presentation under the assumption that we can talk about moral grading. So 2 assumptions about the 2 big questions driving this portion of the talk are going to be, 1, we're going to assume the classicist approach to moral standing. There's a set of necessary and sufficient conditions. And then in the case of moral grading, we're going to assume that grading makes sense. And if we want to talk about the objections to it, again, towards the end. Okay, now some definitions. So phenomenal consciousness, for those of you not aware of that term, I'm just going to use a standard definition borrowed from Tom Nagel and David Chalmers. It's about subjective experience. An entity has phenomenal consciousness when there's something it's like to be in a state of the creature. And then I'm going to use the term affective consciousness as a subset of phenomenal consciousness where feeling and emotion is present over and above there being something it's like to be in the state. So affective consciousness is the feeling sort of component of a conscious state, and phenomenal consciousness is sort of what it's like. Now, there's a technical question in the literature about whether phenomenal consciousness implies affective consciousness and whether affective consciousness applies phenomenal consciousness. I'm going to assume that the answer to the second question is clearly yes. If there's some feeling or hedonic tone to the state you're in, then there's a way it's like to be in that state. The more controversial one is whether or not the first one is true. So in a moment, we'll discuss the fact that David Chalmers thinks the first one is false. Something can be phenomenally conscious without there being any affective consciousness. However, I should just clarify right away, in the Buddhist tradition of philosophy and Abhidharma, that first claim is clearly false. Phenomenal consciousness goes right along with the notion of hedonic tone. So in terms of different traditions of philosophy, that first one is pretty controversial, while the second one is non-controversial. Okay. In addition, it's common in this debate to talk about the notion of phenomenal suffering. So phenomenal suffering is the more common sense notion that we're all aware of. When we say, oh, Bill is suffering or Maria is suffering, we usually are implying something about the fact that there's some feeling that they have in their suffering, and that's what we're tying. Oftentimes we're saying the suffering is a kind of pain. It's a pain state of a certain kind. And then we're going to get into what it means to endorse the pain state in a state of suffering that makes it suffering. But the main point is that there's suffering in a phenomenal sense. There's something it's like to suffer, and there's an affective state associated with it. So phenomenal suffering goes along with a type of affective consciousness. On the other hand, I think there's another type of suffering called cognitive suffering. I think cognitive suffering has to do with having a set of preferences where your preferences are not satisfied, whether or not you feel anything about those preferences being satisfied whatsoever. So cognitive suffering tries to connote the idea of suffering in terms of preference, non-satisfaction, or non-optimal preference satisfaction. So in a way, you're deprived because your preferences aren't satisfied, but we don't make any mention in the definition directly to the notion of phenomenal consciousness. So we don't tie it to an affective state. So again, there are questions. Does phenomenal suffering imply cognitive suffering? Does cognitive suffering imply phenomenal suffering? I'm at least going to take it to be the case that cognitive suffering can be understood without phenomenal suffering, and I'm not going to take a position on the first question for now. Okay, so those are some definitions. Okay, so a starting point about moral standing that's common in Western philosophy is to think about the work of Peter Singer, who gave the expanding circle argument, and what that argument was trying to do was to say that the feature and virtue of which we have moral standing is a capacity to phenomenally suffer, and because that extends out to non-human animals, we have to include non-human animals in the sphere of those things that have moral standing as well, and equal moral standing was the kind of view he was going for. So this is a very common point to begin thinking about morals, and this is actually a kind of way of making one of the arguments I'm interested in. Artificial systems don't phenomenally suffer. Phenomenal suffering is the kind of thing that we care about when we're talking about moral standing. So artificial systems don't have any moral status. They lack the feature that is important, and that's the feature that Peter Singer would say is important. So I think that approach is a bit dated, so I think it's important to look at two more recent approaches to talking about this question. One is the one defended by David Chalmers in Reality Plus towards the end of the book, where he talks about moral standing. And another one is the one I'm more inspired by, which comes from a philosopher named Umasvati, who wrote the Tattvartha Sutra, the Jain tradition, in around the 8th century. So I'm actually going to look at both of these traditions and generating my answer. I'm actually going to say, in some sense, that both of them got something wrong, but they both got something right. But I want to, instead of just pigeoning it on someone like Peter Singer and the Western tradition, I want to engage other traditions of philosophy that had something to say that can be extended to a discussion of moral standing with respect to artificial systems. So you might not have thought you could find in non-Western philosophy ideas that are relevant for talking about moral standing with respect to AI. I think that's incorrect. I think there's actually a lot to offer in non-Western traditions. Okay. So one of the things that Chalmers holds in his approach, so keep Peter Singer in mind. So Chalmers is going to say to, David's going to say to Peter, hey, I think that there are a kind of creatures, let's call them Vulcans, which are kind of philosophical versions of Spock, the character in Star Trek, where basically they don't have any emotional life, which shows up in many episodes in the original series, but they have a thick, rich, rational life. And for them, there's something it's always like to be in a certain kind of state, but there's no affective consciousness there. I think Spock has moral status, but he doesn't have what Peter Singer would say, phenomenal suffering, because he doesn't have affective consciousness. Now, I don't think it's a correct characterization of Spock, but since Dave likes to talk about philosophical zombies and philosophical Vulcans, we should just think of this as a philosophical version of what Spock is. The claim is that a philosophical Vulcan is someone that has rational capacities, no affective life, but has moral standing. And so he thinks that the ground of moral standing, the answer to the moral grounding problem, is phenomenal consciousness, cut away from affective consciousness, and therefore a wider net than you find in the case of Peter Singer. So if it turned out to be the case that you could show that AI systems had phenomenal consciousness, under Dave's definition, they would have moral standing. Under Peter's definition, they would not. Why? Because Peter thinks affective consciousness is required in addition to phenomenal consciousness, and Dave does not. Umasvati doesn't have a concept of phenomenal consciousness deriving from Thomas Nagel up through David Chalmers, nor do I think he would really understand it. And part of the reason why is I think the Jains share in common with some Buddhists the idea that affective consciousness and phenomenal consciousness are one and the same thing. There is no way to talk about it being something it's like to be in a certain state without saying there's a hedonic tone to that state. So certain Buddhists in the Abhidharma tradition very clearly argue that for every single state of consciousness, phenomenal, there's something it's like to be, there's going to be some hedonic tone. The Jains seem to hold the same view also. So their approach thinking about moral standing, because they have a very wide net, like Dave, which is larger than Peter's, is to extend affective consciousness down to the smallest, tiniest microbes. So the smallest, tiniest microbes for Jains have affective consciousness. So their technique is, we will expand the circle further than Peter by making affective consciousness go all the way out to plants, trees, and microbes. And Dave's technique is, I will extend out the moral standing net by taking phenomenal consciousness out further and cutting it away from affective consciousness. So those are the two different routes that are different than Peter's. Good. Okay. So this sort of approach of thinking about sentientism in these two different ways, sometimes the difference is what's known as narrow versus broad. So the narrow version is Dave's definition. The broad one is obviously Peter's, or the affective consciousness one. So there's a group of people who actually, including myself, have been writing recently, think this is all wrong. And Gwen Bradford is a very good example of this. So constantly what's coming up in this new literature are people saying, well, doesn't this run afoul of the very same fallacy that Peter Singer tried to avoid? If we were trying to say it's speciesist to prefer humans over non-human animals when the very same property that makes us matter is found in them, wouldn't it be kind of a bit odd to be constantly thinking about consciousness in the same way? Isn't consciousness something like where we're saying, oh, consciousness is the glowing factor, and in the other case we're saying, well, the humans is the glowing factor. We're preferring a species, now we're preferring a kind of mental state. And so they're questioning whether or not consciousness really is the grounding property. That's what this new literature is. It's been coming about for a couple of years. Maybe it's a little bit older in some places, but at least in mainstream analytic philosophy, it's now coming out that many people, including myself, are questioning whether or not consciousness is the correct grounding property. So let's see. So Joshua Shepard writes, consciousness-based approaches to non-human moral status maintain that consciousness is necessary for some degree or level of moral status. While these approaches are intuitive to many, in this paper argued that the judgment that consciousness is necessary for moral status is not secure enough to guide policy regarding non-humans. The policies responsive to the moral status of non-humans should take seriously the possibility that psychological features independent of consciousness are sufficient for moral status. There's also this very common argument that people use where they say if you're an illusionist about consciousness and you think that phenomenal properties are just an illusion, then how do you ground moral standing in that? Aren't you saying that in some sense what it is to have moral standing is to have this property that's a mere illusion? That's somewhat in tension with the idea that moral standing is a real property that something has, yet you're grounding it in something that's an illusion. So I'm not saying that's inconsistent or impossible to hold that position, but there clearly seems to be some tension there, and this is clearly a tension that other people have brought out, that if illusionism is the leading theory in the scientific exploration of consciousness, and that turns out to be true, then grounding moral status, and that seems a bit odd. Okay, Shepard again says, our knowledge that consciousness is morally significant is based upon introspection, but what humans introspect is nothing more than various aspects of consciousness. Humans lack access to non-conscious mentality, so if non-conscious mentality had moral significance, we could not come to know it in the way we come to know that it matters in our own case. So he's saying there's a special epistemic problem, right? Okay, so hold on one second before I get to the positive answer. So again, I don't want to say that these things are decisive. I just want to make it clear that if it just seemed so intuitive that consciousness is what matters, there seems to be a good pressure point that's coming in the last several years against this view where people are just picking apart certain aspects of how it is that it is the grounding property. That's what I think is really what's going on. Okay, so the answer I prefer is to think about preferential states in relationship to phenomenal suffering. And the first way I'm going to do that before I define the way in which I actually will use it is just by talking about this idea of suffering, that's phenomenal suffering, and the concept of endorsement. So many people are athletes to a certain degree. You go to the gym and you run. I mean, and after a couple of minutes on the treadmill, you're like, this sucks, right? And then your coach says, no pain, no gain, right? So suffering in some sense can't just be the phenomenal thing. It has to be somehow the endorsement of what's going on with the phenomenal pain. Because I don't think you walk off the treadmill after you did this great run and wanted to do it and say to yourself, I was suffering, right? Maybe you do in some sense, but the thing is the good that you wanted, the exercise, trumps the feeling. The preference plays a role in figuring out whether the phenomenal state had any of the important features we actually care about. So even when we point to phenomenal suffering as being relevant to grounding moral standing, we don't typically do it without thinking about the preferences of the subject involved who is undergoing the and in Indian philosophy, this is commonly talked about in the concept of undergoing an operation, right? You want the pain of the operation in order to get rid of the disease, right? So in some sense, the pain or what the doctor is doing to you and harming you is warranted, right? So this is a way of cutting that out. The other case I like a lot more. A lot of people don't recognize that there's a well-known phenomenon known as pain asymbolia. And in pain asymbolia, you lack the capacity to feel a high degree of phenomenal pain because of the way in which your receptors have been damaged. So for subjects who have pain asymbolia, we can definitely talk about their preferential states and what they desire and don't desire in terms of what situation they would like to be in. Like, for example, if someone had pain asymbolia, they might say to you, please don't break my arm because I like to play my cello, and by breaking my arm, I won't be able to play my cello. But it's not going to be explained in terms of any pain state. It's going to be explained in terms of their cognitive relationship to a preference that they want, right? So I think the first point to be made here is that our understanding, even when consciousness seems to matter, is related to an evaluation of preferences that a subject can undergo, and those preferences being satisfied or not satisfied. It's not ever really the case that it's just the mere phenomenal thing in and of itself that's doing the work. That's the first thing I'll make. Okay. So based on that now, I want to go forward into thinking about the second part of my talk, which is grading. So I first talked about grounding. At this point, what I've tried to suggest is that grounding is not to be done in terms of phenomenal consciousness in and of itself, right? Preferences matter, right? You might still think that phenomenal consciousness is part of the story. I'll eventually cut that completely free. But at this point, what I'm going for is that preferences are what matter. So when we talk about the preferences of a system and the preferences not being satisfied, we can say that the system or whatever the organism is suffering in some sense. It's suffering in a cognitive sense, not in a phenomenal sense, but that cognitive sense definitely matters, right? Okay, so we can get back to talking about more of that. So let's talk about grading a little bit. So the thing about grading that I liked, which I got from Indian philosophy, became very clear to me as an overall idea. So the idea of grading in Umasvati is this idea that there are different sense capacity creatures, 1 sense, 2 sense, 3 sense, 4 sense creatures, 5 sense creatures. And I think this is also found in some other traditions of Buddhism where they make similar sort of recognition of these different sensed creatures. And then basically the Jains are very big on the doctrine of ahimsa, which is the goal that you have to in your life create the least amount of harm possible to all the creatures that you're interacting with. Which leads to this very common issue. Well, eating is causing harm, so what do Jains eat? Well, they're very strict vegetarians, can't even have onion and garlic and stuff like that. So it looks like on their view, it's got to be the case that eating plants in some sense, which causes harm, doesn't matter as much as eating a frog, because if it did matter more, then you could eat the frog, but you can't, right? So it's got to be the case that this is a graded theory. So their theory is a graded theory of moral standing. Things higher up in the scale of sense capacities are things that have higher moral status than things that are lower down. They do the grading on the number of sense capacities and also a specific account of what sense capacities are. But what I like in the theory, which I'm going to talk about in a moment in more detail, is that it's a graded view. It recognizes that some things have lower moral standing than others in virtue of a property that they think matters, which is the number of sense capacities, right? So it's giving the account structurally. Grading matters, and the property that grades is the number of sense capacities, right? So this is not the sort of notion we saw in Peter Singer, for example, but it's a notion you can find in this specific Indian tradition. And it all turns out also that they're very ethos friendly to being very sort of nonviolent. So in fact, in their nonviolent view of the world, they also have a graded view of moral standing, which is interesting. Okay, good. So part of his rationale for doing this has to do with a property that I don't think is relevant for talking about AI. And so I'll just quickly flag it so you don't think I'm sort of not paying respect to this tradition. So it has to do with liberation. So Jains believe that the soul can be liberated, and what it is for the soul to be liberated is for it to be in at least the stage where it's in a human form, so it has the capacity to be liberated. But this part of the theory is not relevant to my view. Right? So it's not relevant that we actually buy karma theory as an ethical theory. It's not relevant that we buy that there's a soul. It's not relevant that we buy in liberation. All that's necessary is that we buy that there is a structural property, grading, and that grading is explained by some specific thing that grades. That's the part that I want from the view. Okay. So what I'm going to extract from them is a structural claim. I'm going to drop the commitment to the existence of a soul, and I'm going to drop the property of affective consciousness. So again, remember, what they think matters is that all these things, all the way down to the microbes, can feel pain, right? So you might think, well, I don't think microbes can feel pain. They're going to say, well, the microbes can feel pain, right? So I'm going to drop that property. So why am I going to drop that property? Well, the pushback to both Dave's view and the Jain view is that in both cases, I don't think that consciousness is what matters, be it affective or phenomenal. So I think there's another property that's more important, and that's the one now I'm going to put in place of affective consciousness and then build out on a graded construction. Okay, so my view is that sensory capacities tied to preferential states are necessary for moral standing. Computational intelligence is necessary for sensory states tied to preferential states. So computational intelligence tied to preferential states is necessary for moral standing. So my idea is that when we look specifically at what matters, we're going to notice that a type of intelligence that can satisfy and fail to satisfy preferential states of an organism is what grounds moral standing, that type of capacity. But what those sensory capacities really are forms of computational intelligence. And because of that, it's computational intelligence that can drive a system or a creature towards its preferential states and away from its non-preferred states is what does the moral grounding. Okay, so now two caveats that are going to be very important here. Clearly, by sensory capacity, I don't mean the phenomenal notion that a sensory capacity is one in virtue of which there's a phenomenal type associated with it. Like hearing, auditory, this has a certain phenomenal type associated with it. I don't mean a sensory capacity in that way. A sensory capacity is more tied to the capacity for some form of information processing in a computational form. Secondly, obviously, I'm not using the word intelligence here, in which the word intelligence goes one-to-one with the concept of phenomenal consciousness. So some people might think, what I just mean by intelligence is that there's phenomenal consciousness present. I am clearly not using the word intelligence in that way. Okay, so that's the basic structure of the idea of what the core notion is that grounds moral standing. It's a type of computational intelligence that is tied, it's not just any generic kind, it's tied to the system having preferential states and the intelligence being able to drive it. So let's look at some examples now to make sense of this. So on my understanding of my view, because I'm using computational intelligence and preferential states, rocks don't have any computational intelligence. Plants are intelligent and they have preferential states. So do bivalves, invertebrates, vertebrates, and so does artificial intelligence. So those are the primary cases. I think I get all of those cases in the moral sphere without talking about sentience or affective consciousness or phenomenal consciousness. I get it just in virtue of the fact that I can say of these things that there is intelligence and there are preferential states, and their intelligence aims towards their preferential states. In addition, there's a growing literature about the secondary class of cases, social groups, corporations, and nations. These are collectives, right? And so I think my view can be extended to talk about how social groups can have moral standing and corporations. And actually the talk I gave in Dublin was on applying my theory to corporations, how a corporation has moral status in virtue of being a type of intelligent system with preferential states. So I definitely think this view applies in both those cases. But if you wanted to know what is the difference, so for example, there's going to be a question. The Jains are going to say the plants have affective consciousness, and that's why they're in the sphere. Peter Singer is going to say they're not affectively consciousness. Dave is going to say the plants maybe have phenomenal consciousness. I'm not sure what Dave's view is on about the plants and phenomenal consciousness. I'm hoping everybody but Philip Goff is going to say that rocks don't have any type of consciousness, but Philip seems to go in for the view that even the rocks are conscious. Abhinavagupta, the very famous Indian 11th century Kashmiri Shaivist, also goes in for the view that rocks are sentient. So, you can cut your thing on the, I'm an anti-rock person, not because I don't like rocks. I just don't think they have intrinsic moral value. But I think I get the other things. And also, this is very important for me. It is very difficult to tell even when some of these things are conscious. It's very hard to deny they're intelligent. That's what I like about my view. I like the fact that it's very easy to say that plants are intelligent, much harder to look at the evidence and say they're conscious. So I think intelligence is a safer grounding property. Not a grading property, but a grounding property. Okay, so there are things that amplify, now we're talking about grading. So if you are phenomenally conscious, affectively consciousness, you have a degree of free will, self-awareness, or rationality, you might say you matter more, right? So you might say, look, the things that are intelligent, like a microbe, but lack phenomenal consciousness, like an octopi, matter less. Why? Because phenomenal consciousness grades moral standing, it doesn't ground it. So something can be a grading property without being a grounding property. So a grading property might be the capacity for emotional life, rationality, the possession of a self, the ability for long-term planning. This is the issue of grading something and saying it marks a different scale. So they're individual metrics, phenomenal conscious, affective, free will, self-awareness, rationality. Those themselves then come in clusters, right? So, for example, affective consciousness implies phenomenal consciousness. So if you're affectively conscious, you're phenomenally conscious. So you have the cluster affective phenomenal. So clusters combine together, and on my view, it's clusters that mark different points on a graded scale. So we're grading a metric moving from the basic grounding property, which is computational intelligence tied to preferential states, which everything but the rocks get. And then we're saying, now look in between those. The humans are phenomenally conscious. The plants are phenomenally conscious, maybe, or the plants are not phenomenally conscious. Some are affectively, some have free will. There are certain degrees of it. And then we grade them, and we grade them based on clusters. That's called the grading concept. So what I disagree with most philosophers about is the grounding property. I'm an anti-sentience because I think intelligence is the grounding property. Where I agree with many of them is that the other properties are grading properties. But I think it's very difficult to say why consciousness, for example, is a grading property. That's what some of the contemporary debate's about. Okay, so capacities come together. Capacities mark different points. I've already said this. Okay, good. Okay, good. We're coming down to the next part. Okay, good. So now you've got my overall picture. Let's just summarize the first part of the talk. Grounding is done in terms of intelligence. Grading is done in terms of consciousness, rationality, free will, things like that. Okay? That's the way I look at it. So that's my pushback on the other views that are out there. And on my view, it should be very easy now to get artificial systems and microbes in the moral sphere in terms of the most basic grounding property without having to answer questions about sentience. The sentience issue will be pushed forward in terms of the realm of grading their degree based on the cluster they instantiate. Okay, so let's talk about something I think that artificial systems can have. So here's another common argument I hear in Silicon Valley. Emotions such as anger and love are feelings. In order for something to feel, it must have the capacity for phenomenal consciousness. Artificial systems lack the capacity for phenomenal consciousness, so artificial systems cannot have emotions. I've heard this argument hundreds of times. In fact, at the thing I was doing on Saturday by Zoom where I was commenting on papers, many people were running this kind of argument. And so, so emotions in English is derived from the Latin emovere. It means to stir the sentiments. We should pay attention to the linguistics of it. There's this general issue in the philosophy of emotions between talking about what are feeling-like or feeling-associated states and the individuation of them. So some things are emotions, and then you might say, well, Is compassion, sympathy, and empathy, are they emotions or are they just feeling like states? Are they in the feeling like camp where feelings are associated with them? So this is an important thing. We should be able to clearly distinguish between something being a feeling and something being an emotion. And the claim that I'm concerned with is whether or not emotions are present in machines, not feelings, not things that are essentially feeling like states. So you could say, for example, which Carlos Montemayor has argued about AI systems, that empathy is essentially a feeling like state. Right, so that would make it a very different claim than what someone could do with the claim about anger, where someone would say anger is an emotion, and then, as I'll discuss, whether feelings are essential to it. Okay, so we already did the definition of phenomenal consciousness, so you understand that when people are saying that emotions are feeling, they're saying that phenomenal consciousness is required. Okay, another thing that we have to talk about here is when people want to say artificial systems lack the capacity for phenomenal consciousness, in some sense, in my view, they're talking about the substrate dependence question. So in my understanding in consciousness studies, a lot of the issue fails to take into consideration the simple fact that if we're going to talk about consciousness arising in a silicon-based system, we ought to be discussing the issue of whether or not silicon itself can give rise to consciousness. This is a material science question. This is a substrate dependence question. It's pretty much well articulated in the work of Susan Schneider. So this, I think, is part of why some people will say artificial systems can't have phenomenal consciousness. It's because of a substrate dependence issue. Okay? And so they draw the conclusions that artificial systems cannot have emotions. This is the basic idea. Machines don't feel. Feeling is necessary for emotions. Bye-bye. Okay. So one way to block this argument is to do the exact opposite, is to say, no, actually, artificial systems can be phenomenally conscious. This is the view that many people have where they're trying to argue about phenomenal consciousness present in artificial systems. And once they get the phenomenal consciousness off the ground, they think it's an easy step to the fact that they can have emotions. This argument, I think, is wrong. And the reason why I think this argument is wrong is because it takes a very pernicious premise, one that's very hard to assess, whether or not an artificial system is phenomenally conscious, in order to get a conclusion you can get much quicker and on a much better argument. So I'm just going to bypass this argument. If it turns out to also be true that there's a path from phenomenal consciousness in artificial systems to emotions in artificial systems, so be it. But I don't think it's necessary, and it seems to run afoul of what the literature already allows for. So I'm going to explore this argument. Some artificial systems can acquire artificial general intelligence. Artificial general intelligence is the benchmark for access consciousness. Access consciousness is tied to the ability to make judgments, reason from them, and act rationally in relation to them. Some emotions are exhaustively captured by judgments, so those artificial systems that can acquire artificial general intelligence can have some emotions. This is the argument I like because it bypasses the issue of phenomenal consciousness and takes us to a question that we can assess more clearly, the presence of access consciousness in artificial systems. I think this is a firmer available argument that we can talk about right now. So I will build this argument out. Okay, so the first claim has to do with artificial general intelligence. And here I think it's really an expertise within the discipline type of thing. I'm not really an expert on AGI. It's hard for me to assess exactly the plausibility of it, but my understanding from looking at the literature is I haven't seen an in-principle reason why AGI is impossible that's been presented on behalf of even people who work in this area. What I see most of the time is a block in understanding how to move forward on the issue or an issue about the complexity required to do it, but I don't see an in-principle problem about machines having artificial general. And for those who are wondering what I mean specifically by AGI, it's very clear the kind of notion I'm talking about. So we already know that there's something called domain-specific intelligence. Lots of artificial systems are very good at beating you at chess, very good at beating you at Go, making novel moves in Go, solving protein folding problems. Ask it to pack a bag, talk to you at the same time while doing some other task, 3 tasks, and all of a sudden everything falls apart. That seems to be very, very difficult for a system to do. But that could just be a moment. That could just be like where we are now. If we looked at where we are now relative to the 1980s debate between John Searle and other people, people would have been, oh, okay, this is obviously a different place. So I'm basically just going to, leave this to the experts, but I think I haven't seen any evidence to suggest that this is impossible, that AGI can happen. Okay. Is the capacity for emotions tied to consciousness? So again, it seems like this issue can't go away very easily. Like it constantly comes back up, and we constantly talk about the fact that when even we attribute emotions to non-human animals like cows, we're also attributing to them states of phenomenal consciousness. So the case of emotions in non-human animals seems to be something we have to discuss in relationship to emotions in us as well as AI. So obviously, some type of consciousness seems to be relevant. So for those unfamiliar with this distinction, there was a distinction made by Ned Block back in like the 90s, 1995, I guess 96, where he drew a distinction between access consciousness and phenomenal consciousness. So to say that a state is access consciousness, it is if it is in virtue of having the state, a representation of its content is poised for use as a premise in reasoning, poised for rational control of action, poised for rational control of speech. And importantly, he argued that access consciousness can occur without phenomenal consciousness. I'm going to, I think, skip the movie, but, oh no, it's gonna go anyway. Okay, so let me just, so what is blind sight, in case you don't know what blind sight is? There's a movie about blind sight. So blind sight occurs when, for example, the right side of your visual field becomes completely blind. So you'll say things like, I don't see anything in front of me in terms of the right side of my visual field. But then if I ask you to grab forward and pick up an object in the right side of your visual field, you can do it reliably. You can pick up the pen in front of you, although you can't see it. So in the video I just had, this was an experiment where someone with blind sight was asked to walk down a hall and navigate a number of objects and obstacles in their path. And they carefully walked down the hall all the time saying, I can't see anything on the right side of my visual field, and navigating around all the objects. So this is supposed to suggest, which is still controversial in the literature, that the subject has a lack of phenomenal consciousness in the visual channel of the right side of their visual field, but they have access consciousness, the ability to talk, navigate, make judgments in their visual field, and move around objects. So potentially, you can have access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness. There's some question about the degree that you can dump phenomenality. So for example, someone will say, well, the subject still has auditory phenomenal consciousness, they just lack visual phenomenal. And then you play these games where people are like, well, you can imagine away the other one. I like the case of thinking of just super blind sight, right? Blind sight is usually in one in the visual modality or one sensory modality. You just think of like the super blind sight case. That's a philosophy thought experiment. So if super blind sight is possible, that's access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness. If we can talk about zombies in some sense, we should be able to talk about the super blind sight case, which I think is very interesting. Then Carlos Montemayor and Garrett Mint, two really good philosophers of mind, wrote this really long and complicated paper where they just tried to establish one conditional. What they tried to show was that AGI yields a type of distribution of attention, where attention itself is not understood phenomenologically, but in terms of how it's understood in cognitive neuroscience. And that once you have attention distribution, you have the necessary fundamental condition for access consciousness. Because what access consciousness is focusing on is attention distribution. So the linking move is AGI yields attention. Attention distribution is necessary for access consciousness. So access consciousness requires AGI. So the idea is that you're going to get access consciousness in a system, a type of consciousness, once you get AGI, right? So now nothing of phenomenal consciousness is being talked about in Montemayor and Mint's work. What they're just trying to establish is that there is a pathway. And again, I want to make it clear. Their paper does not establish that access consciousness follows immediately upon the acquisition of AGI. It's basically doing the benchmark sort of argument. These are the marking things we would think. If you don't have AGI, talking about access consciousness seems very remote. But once you have AGI on the table, the spark of what it would be to have access consciousness seems to be there. And I think there's good evidence in their paper to suggest that's a good link. Okay, good. So once you have access consciousness, you can make all the right sort of judgments, because that's what access consciousness, if you can walk down the hallway and you can make judgments about obstacles without seeing them, then you can make judgments in the relevant sense, in the robust sense, relevant with having access consciousness without phenomenal consciousness. So access consciousness gives us the ability to make judgments, act judgments, and reason from them. That's exactly what it's supposed to be doing, okay? So now we get to the part where I think we can really flip the switch really quickly to show how the debate goes in favor of machine emotions or artificial system emotions. In a lot of the literature historically about the nature of emotions in Western philosophy, it has been well recognized that there are three different things that talk of emotions goes along with. One is that there are feelings, what we talked about earlier on. One is that there's a physiology, there's something that's changing somatically in the body. And another one is that there are cognitions. If you're angry, there's some sort of judgment you're making about a person. If you're in love with someone, there's some sort of judgment you're making. If you're irritated, there's another judgment. But roughly speaking, there's these, I think Herman talks about this, or Jesse Prince talks about this in terms of the parts, the different parts that correlate with what an emotion is. And so you can ask which, if any, of these are essential, or are they all essential, right? So any versus all. And so my position is that neither feeling nor physiology are essential to emotions. The basic argument is that for a given emotion E, either the feeling, physiology, or cognition associated with E is essential alone or in some combination with the other aspects. If feeling is essential, then it is impossible to have the emotion and regulate feeling. If physiology is essential, then it is impossible to have E and regulate the physiology. It is possible to regulate feeling and physiology in various ways, so neither feeling nor physiology are essential. So I call this the basic structural argument, and that leads into the argument from emotion regulation. So again, my way of getting to this argument actually does not derive from the classical moves that people get from reading Martha Nussbaum. She's a very big proponent of the cognitivist theory of emotions that derives from the work of the Stoics, which is a very plausible theory in my opinion. But my approach to getting to a position that pushes back on the feeling aspect, or what might be known as the James Lang theory from William James, is to actually look at a technique that became very popular over the last decade because of some people who were interested in mindfulness meditation, actually. I'm not saying that this is actually what the Buddhists think. I'm actually saying it's just a very popular notion in San Francisco, where people are doing mindfulness meditation for all sorts of stress relief things. They'll be like, well, I'm stressed out and I'm angry. So people will be like, well, breathe, and close your eyes and do these exercises. And lo and behold, they're like, yeah, I feel better. I'm not so tense. I'm like, okay, good. So what happened there? Are you still upset in your mind? Do you have a judgment that you're angry at your boss for giving you an extra workload over the weekend when it was your week off? Well, yes. But how do you feel inside? Well, I don't feel so bad, right? Okay, so the judgment remained the same. The physiology changed in virtue of the breathing, and the feelings that supervene, in my opinion, on the physiology dissipated to a certain degree. So if you can have the emotion in terms of the judgment and you can regulate the feelings and the physiology, it seems to me that what's the emotion, essential to the emotion has got to be the judgment component and not the feeling. And so unlike the arguments I think that Martha Nussbaum brings out about variation across different people, that for some people there is really not a strong feeling component to their emotional life, and for other people there's an overly intense one, what we call cross-cultural or cross-subject variation. I think there's within a subject variation over time, and that time variation has to do with doing these exercises. And I don't think these exercises would be plausible if they weren't in some sense speaking to the fact that people do report afterwards, yeah, I'm less stressed, I'm less tense. But all those words are physiological words and words relating to their feelings. They're not ones that say, I'm really no longer angry. I don't believe anymore that what my boss did was bad. In fact, I think what they say is, this allows me to move on with my life and my situation because those feelings that stop me from doing certain things have dissipated. But yeah, inside, there's something there that I'm holding on to, which, and maybe that takes time to get rid of. But I think that's what's going on. Yeah. So one thing that people oftentimes say to me as an objection to this emotion regulation object is the range objection. So the range objection basically says, well, look, why don't we say this? All three are essential, and anytime you move one a little bit, you actually change the emotion subtly. So actually, anger isn't an emotion. It's a range between anger 1 and anger n. And within all those, all three components are essential. And as soon as you change one parameter a little bit, you just get you're just a little bit different. You're not angry in the same sense. you're angry in this. Look, it's got like a range of things. So you never get rid of, you can never claim that the emotion judgment stays the same while the other things vary. Because every time another property varies, you instantiate another degree of anger, right? That's the range objection. I hope that makes sense. They're basically just pulling on another part and saying that because they're all connected, you're still getting a different emotion. It's just called anger. So I think that's completely implausible. I think it's completely plausible to say there's a difference between irritation, rage, and anger. Okay? That's a completely reasonable way to mark things up. But if you're going to tell me there's an infinite gradation of anger for every microcosmal difference you can make in your breathing exercise compared to the person next to you, that's going to blow up the number of emotional states we have. And so I think that's an overproduction. It's an anti-Occam's razor move in a way that is completely unnecessary. I don't see any reason. I see it's completely plausible to say there are different degrees and different ranges of an emotion, and we mark them with words in different languages for their subtlety. But to take this degree, because if you practice these exercises, your emotion regulation can get really subtle. It can get really subtle and fine-grained. And then to say for every single subtle marking, there's a one-to-one correspondence with a new emotion seems completely implausible to me. So that's my response to that objection. Okay, so now we just come to the conclusion that if some emotions are essentially judgments and not feelings, we have a pathway to making the argument that we can actually have emotions in machines, okay? So again, we're not talking about all feeling-like states. We're talking about some, okay? So here's the final argument. Some emotions, such as anger, are present when a certain kind of judgment is made. Artificial systems with AGI have access consciousness. Access consciousness is what makes the judgments possible for them to be in your mind in the right way. So those artificial systems that achieve AGI can have some emotions. So again, my argument wouldn't lead to the conclusions that LLMs, for example, right away have emotions, because the AGI question isn't answered really, but that's okay. I mean, I'm in the range of saying that that's something that's plausible because I'm giving a little bit of a tighter fit. Okay, so one thing people say to me, Anand, you've argued that, you know, making judgments of a certain kind is necessary for having emotions, but you haven't answered the question of what other conditions are sufficient. What makes it so that it's necessary and sufficient? I think that if you take the response from exhaustiveness, which comes from like the Nussbaum type of cognitivist literature, then you get the result right away, because the view that the cognitivists have is this: the right pattern of beliefs is necessary and sufficient. That's all that's required. Nothing more is required. I actually like the view that what is required is that the judgments / beliefs are actually in the range of attention at a certain point, that they are attended to. For them to be your emotions, those beliefs must be attended to at a certain point. So my view is that it's the judgment plus the attention, and I get the attention also because AGI gives access consciousness, which is attention distribution. So that's my way out of that objection. And okay, so why did this matter? So now I've shown that artificial systems have the grounding property for moral status. That grounding property is intelligence tied to preferential states. But now I've also tried to argue that if there are grading properties, like phenomenal consciousness and affective consciousness, artificial systems have a grading property too. What is that grading property? They have an emotional life, right? So an emotional life is not the same as being affectively conscious. Affective consciousness has to do with the feeling that goes along with what humans have as an emotional life. But an emotional life can be independent of that, because affective consciousness is not the same as an emotion, because we've sort of argued that what's essential to some emotions is having the judgment part and not the feeling part. So also, finally, it's not clear to me yet whether we should give the full range of basic emotions to artificial systems. What I do think works really well is anger. I think so far, and this is scary actually when you think about artificial systems, my claim would be that the one emotion that seems like they can produce very soon, if not already, would be anger. That's kind of, so sometimes I call this part of my paper, machines can have emotions, and you ought to be very scared because the emotions they have, the one that seems most plausible is the one that has to do with this judgment. So the anger version, I think, works. But there's a range of emotions, and the relationship that they have to the emotion regulation argument is not clear to me. So I don't want to go. All right, so closing out, I just want to say this one thing. So some people are very worried that my view of grading leads to a problem known as morism, which is if one thing has more capacities than another, then automatically that thing has higher moral status. This is a very easy result if you take integrated information theory. So some people think that consciousness is the metric for moral standing, and integrated information theory uses phi to measure degrees of consciousness. If you take that view, then having more degrees of consciousness means higher moral standing on a graded view, because the only thing that grades is consciousness on such a view. So I don't believe that morism is true. I think that two things can have different capacities, but not every difference in capacity marks a difference in moral status. Why is this true? If you studied economics, you know of something called a threshold effect, right? You can cross a threshold upon which the difference that took you to the threshold no longer matter. Here's a very simple example. Two people can be different in height, yet one of them, be different in height, but both of them are tall, right? Right. So two people can be such that one is taller than the other, but they're both still tall, right? That's a threshold effect. You've crossed the height boundary for being tall. Likewise, I can walk and talk. Maybe my friend who does not have all his cognitive, his ambulatory capacities can't walk. That doesn't mean I have greater moral status than him. Not every difference in capacities. So I deny morism, but grading does require that something like a capacity difference will matter, because that's what my view is. Okay. So I think the bottom line for me is, right here. Artificial systems have moral standing because they are intelligent systems that have preferences. Those preferences can be frustrated by not being satisfied, and an artificial system can cognitively suffer in virtue of the fact that its preferences are not satisfied. Artificial systems can have an emotional life. Although they cannot feel, they can have emotions, and their emotions can structure their lives. And thinking about artificial systems, we need to recognize that their moral standing is not simply to be found in their intelligence, but also in their emotional life. Thank you.
All right, taking questions.